Hi everyone and welcome back. In today's tutorial I am working on some mixed media Cameo canvases. I will be using a variety of supplies, starting first with these digital stamps. The girls are from the Keeping Cozy set, and there's a link to that and to my shop in the description box below if you'd like to get a set of these digital stamps for yourself to use in your own projects. I had coloured the stamps in a previous video using alcohol-based markers. I'll leave a link to that video in the iCards if you want to watch that tutorial first. I also have 3 wood oval canvases, some distress oxide inks, stencils, texture paste, wooden elements and some stamps. As always, there will be a full list of all the supplies I used in the video description box down below. So let's get started. I began by gessoing each of the canvases. I add this thin coat of white gesso to prime the wood, and it will help the mixed media elements to stick better onto the wood surface afterwards. After the gesso was dry, I used the Distress Oxide inks to add some colour. I was going for a vintage colour scheme, lots of browns, neutrals and blacks, so that the background would match the pre-coloured digital stamps. It's quite useful to have elements pre-coloured for a project like this, as once you have your main colour scheme down, all you need to do is match it with the background. I am using scattered straw, frayed burlap and spiced marmalade to colour the backgrounds, and I'm smudging each colour around on the canvas, making sure to clean off my ink pads afterwards just in case any of the colours have transferred between the pads. The colour placement here is not something you need to be very precise about, just smudge the colour evenly around. I then pulled out my spray bottle and sprayed each canvas to oxidize the inks. This will cause them to shift and to change colour. I also felt that at this point that the colours were a little bit too bright, so I dabbed off a little of the excess with a paper towel and then left each of the canvases to dry. The colour actually ended up drying much lighter, so it worked out really well for the backgrounds, as I didn't want them to be too bright or overpowering. The next step was to add some stenciling and some stamping to the backgrounds. I started out with a Hexagon stamp and some Sepia ink. Unfortunately, I've seen to have mislaid that bit of footage, but I simply applied the stencil to areas of each canvas and then brought over a background text stamp. Using some brown ink, I stamped the design around each canvas, varying the placement of each and overhanging it from the edges. I then used a mini hexagon outline stamp to stamp over a few of the stenciled hexagons and to also stamp out some designs into some of the plain areas of the background. There's no real plan as to where the stamps are placed, I'm just adding a few randomly to each canvas, but making sure to stop before I add too many. To build on the vintage colour scheme, I decided to go around the edges of the canvases with a black ink and apply a black border. I was careful not to press too hard or I might ruin the ink pad. I then added even more ink with a sponge, starting at the edges of the canvases and drawing the ink up into the middle. Next I added some more stenciling, but this time using white texture paste. I wanted to create a visual break between the background and the foreground elements, something that could help anchor the digital stamps to the layout. I chose this line of floating bubbles and added a couple of the lines of bubbles to each canvas. When working with texture paste, I often need to pull the paste several times over the stencil to get a smooth look. And it's very easy to scrape off any mistakes with a spatula or a piece of cardstock. Next I trimmed the girls, getting rid of the white border around each one. I usually leave a white border around elements to help them stand out, but here I wanted these foreground elements to blend in more with the background, so I went round each of the girls and trimmed off that white border. I also went round each of them again afterwards with some black ink, just to add to the vintage grungy theme of this project. I used 3D foam squares to attach each girl to her canvas. The 3D foam squares will raise them up off the background a bit, allowing me to be able to tuck other elements in behind them in a moment. Next, I brought over my box of wooden elements and selected a few to use. I like to move things around quite a bit until I find a layout that I like. This step often takes me quite a long time, but once I was happy with the arrangement, I glued all the leaves down in place. I also added in a few butterflies as well. I felt the buttons would complement the vintage theme really nicely, and I love using them in my projects. So I added a few to each canvas, and I also added a few little mini chipboard stars, putting a couple of them on one of the girls to look like earrings. I wanted to give each of the girls a name, so I attached some stickers down to a piece of white cardstock and then cut them out, distressing the edges with a little black ink, and then attached each of those names to the canvas. Sometimes adding a little of the same colour ink to multiple elements can really help everything to feel cohesive. I'm using black ink here as a unifying factor amongst the different elements in my project. I've used it on the background, around the edges of the digital stamps, and then around the edges of the name labels. So if you're having trouble pulling different elements together in a project, then adding a little of the same colour ink around the edges to the different elements may help to unify everything together. The final step was to add a few of the Nuovo drops, and the colour that I'm using today is called Dusty Rose. And that is the finished project. I'm really pleased with how the marker coloured images came together with the mixed media backgrounds to create these little canvases. If you'd like to use one of these girls in your own creations, then there is a link to my shop in the description box below. I hope that you enjoyed watching this project come together today. Which one of these canvases did you like best? Leave me a comment down below and let me know. And you can also ask any questions as well. Thank you for watching and have a creative day.